Hello, you're on the Ruslan Belov channel, and this is the daily summary of combat operations from the Ukrainian front. So is this the end for Yermak? Yermak has submitted his resignation, Zelensky accepted the resignation and dismissed Yermak. And you know many are celebrating, but what has actually happened? Zelensky's positions in Ukraine have significantly deteriorated, significantly weakened with Yermak's departure and dismissal. Zelensky is now politically weaker than ever before. And what does this mean? It means he definitely won't agree to any arrangements regarding the withdrawal of the armed forces of Ukraine from Donetsk region, which means there will be no peace. Which means the war will, with a probability of, 80 to 90%, continue into 2026. That's what has just occurred in Ukraine. Well, combat operations continue even now, and we continue to examine the situation at the front together. So friends, the past 24 hours were also quite productive at the front. The Russian army, for your understanding, took control of more than 40 square kilometers. And the position of the armed forces of Ukraine at the front is becoming worse and worse. Well, let's go in order. And we'll start with Kharkiv region, specifically the Borovsko direction. There was very good advancement there, and forces have approached the urban-type settlement of Borovaya. Now I'll tell you about this in detail and outline the prospects. This sector was dead, now it's become, well, semi-dead, since recently it occasionally provides pleasant surprises with advances. Here, you see, they managed to occupy a fairly solid piece of territory for this direction, covering an area of 10 square kilometers. Forces reached the nearest approaches to 2 settlements at once, not just to Borovaya, but also to Novoplatonovka. From current positions to the village, it's about 2 kilometers. And to Borovaya itself, forces have also approached. To reach the most important urban-type settlement, 1 kilometer 900 meters remain. Look, if forces reach Novoplatonovka and occupy the village, then everyone north of there in the armed forces of Ukraine will find themselves blockaded. And these are their garrisons in Boguslavka and Novaya Krugliakovka, and in a network of strongpoints. And there are quite a few such strongpoints located along the Oskol. Plus, from Novoplatonovka, it will be possible to begin movement toward the northern outskirts of Borovaya, which is also extremely important since Borovaya is a very well-fortified settlement. And approaching from one side alone, well, let's say from here, from Borovskaya Andreevka, there's no way to storm it. In general, we're gradually approaching. The direction has come alive, so we'll be watching carefully. Moving further to the Izium direction. Yes, you heard correctly, we have an Izium direction, here it is. And I told you about the opening of this direction more than a month ago, specifically in the episode from the 19th of October. Yes, advances here are infrequent, but they exist. And the general vector of the offensive here is toward the city of Izium, which was already under Russian control in 2022, but was abandoned during the Kharkiv retreat in autumn of that same 22. Now gradually, little by little, we're beginning activation here. What has been achieved here? Well, the width of the sector where Russian forces advanced is more than 11 kilometers, which is undoubtedly impressive. In the northern part of the sector, fighters are trying to envelop Karpovka from several sides. And as you can see, overall the plan is working. From the north, the village is already blockaded. From the east, we're also pressing. And in the course of a most difficult operation, they managed to occupy a significant piece of territory and begin blockade from the south. The task here isn't completely fulfilled yet. Forces still need to reach the highway, but half the task is behind us. And actually pressing Karpovka is extremely important, because after it, as you can see on the map, there are no serious settlements all the way to Lozovaya, which is on the Oskol. Only the tiny village of Volchyi Yar, which is certainly not capable of stopping the Russian army. That is, losing Karpovka, the armed forces of Ukraine will have to roll back a full 9 kilometers. Well, for now Karpovka is still controlled by the armed forces of Ukraine, and battles continue here, however progress is being made. Moving lower, here the offensive is going toward 2 villages simultaneously, toward Korovy Yar and toward Alexandrovka. From current positions to Korovy Yar, it's 2.5 kilometers, and to Alexandrovka, slightly more than 2 kilometers. Why is reaching Korovi Yar important? Because behind it is located an important logistics hub of the armed forces of Ukraine, the village of Rubtsi, from which forces can then enter Kharkiv region and precisely move toward Izium. This is, of course, still a distant prospect, but nevertheless. And regarding movement toward Alexandrovka, here forces managed to approach within a distance of 2 kilometers, 200 meters from the village. Occupying Alexandrovka will then allow movement further towards Svyatogorsk railway station, and consequently blockading the city of Svyatogorsk from the north. And considering that battles are now ongoing in the urban-type settlement of Yarovaya, well, at least on the approaches to it, battles for Svyatogorsk are in the medium-term plans of the Russian military command. If we summarize the advances on the Izium direction, here 14 square kilometers were taken under control. Well, quite a worthy result. Moving further, also significant advances occurred in the vicinity of Lyman, particularly on the eastern approaches to the city. No settlements were taken here, simply because there aren't any more here, but there was advancement to a depth of more than 6 kilometers. And as a result, territory with an area of more than 12 square kilometers was cleared and taken under control. Overall, as you can see, the situation for Lyman is significantly worsening, especially considering that fighters have now begun movement with the goal of reaching Lyman from the south. Precisely to accomplish this task, the beach and beach complex Varadero were taken under control, this is here, and then fighters reached the outskirts of Dibrova. They haven't entered the village itself yet, but took position on the eastern outskirts, and in the very near future, maybe even today, maybe even as you're watching this episode, battles for the settlement will begin. And what will happen with the fall of Dibrova? With the fall of Dibrova, movement will go towards Staryi Caravan, after which the last and main supply road to Lyman will be cut. This is the Slavyansk-Lyman road. If we remove this logistics from the equation, then that's it. There are no more roads leading into the city. Lyman will then simply meet its end. I don't want to give any forecasts regarding timeframes, but what's the distance here? Let's even measure it together. So, well here, from current positions to Staryi Caravan, it's literally 5.5 kilometers. Is it possible to overcome these 5.5 kilometers during the month of December? Well, probably, it's possible. So there's a high probability that by New Year, Lyman will say goodbye to its logistics, and by spring, if peace isn't concluded, the city will come under Russian control. Yes, if peace is concluded, it will still come under Russian control, just through peaceful means. What else was happening at the front? Well, in Konstantinovka, there was a small but extremely important advance. Here, from the side of recently occupied Ivanopolie, forces managed to advance 1 kilometer and occupy a section of the industrial zone in the southern part of the city, gradually approaching here toward the railway depot and the station. Just like that, quietly, unnoticed, and the south of the city, the south of Konstantinovka, is already gradually falling away from the armed forces of Ukraine. Dnipropetrovsk-Zaporizhzhia direction, Huliaipole sector. The situation for the armed forces of Ukraine is so critical here that Kiev is urgently transferring reserves from other sectors. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to tear through defenses, now already on the Gaichur River, reports military observer Yuri Podolyaka. This is the last well-fortified defense line of the armed forces of Ukraine on this sector of the front. Its breakthrough will catastrophically affect the entire Zaporizhzhia direction. Battles continue on the northern, eastern and southeastern outskirts of Huliaipole. The Russian army has established itself in the urban development. To the north and northwest, Russian forces continue clearing the eastern bank of the Gaichur River. Battles are ongoing for the settlement of Dobropole, and the Russian army is reaching the outskirts of Varvarovka. Thus, practically the entire eastern bank of the river has already been cleared. Moreover, reports appeared yesterday that Russian units entered the settlement of Zareknoye, which is located right after Nechaevka. And thus, if the armed forces of the Russian Federation completely occupy Zareknoye, they will create a bridgehead on the right bank of the Gaichur River, and will also create a threat to Ternovatoye, because this way the main defense line will be breached. Movement also continues toward Alexandrovka and, accordingly, toward Pokrovskoye, moving across fields. The armed forces of the Russian Federation have already established themselves on a bridgehead on the northern bank of the Volkhya River and are conducting battles in the area of Velikomikhailovka, Pokrovsk-Mirnograd direction. The Russian command of the center grouping has finally seized the initiative and is trying to move further already beyond Pokrovsk. Although for now the Kiev regime claims that they control the northern part of Pokrovsk. Yes, their sabotage and reconnaissance groups enter there, undoubtedly, but that's not even the most important thing. If we look carefully at the map, we'll see that in the Grishino area, the armed forces of the Russian Federation also have tactical successes in the southern part. The complete loss of Grishino in the near future will nullify all attempts by the armed forces of Ukraine to enter even the northern part of Pokrovsk, especially since very active operations are now also ongoing in Rodinskoye, clearing of the city. Although the armed forces of Ukraine in the western quarters are desperately resisting, understanding that once again they won't enter there anymore. If they lose Rodinskoye and Grishino, and accordingly the fields between them, then there will be no more entries into the northern part of Pokrovsk, and therefore there can be no question of deblockading the Mirnograd grouping. The Russian army also entered the southern outskirts of Sofievka and is now trying to move north. Konstantinovka direction. The armed forces of the Russian Federation are resuming offensive operations to the north and are having quite significant tactical successes here. If they strike at the rear of Konstantinovka from this line, for Konstantinovka, this could turn into a real catastrophe, especially since the Russian army has already entered the city itself, which awaits the fate of Pokrovsk. Summarizing the overall results of the past 24 hours, there were no occupied settlements, but 44.5 square kilometers of territory came under Russian control. Soon we will be summarizing the results of November together, and I think we'll see the most record-breaking numbers since spring of 2022. Well, that's all I have for today on the situation at the front. Now, let's watch what's happening in the political arena. Loud resignation of Yermak and searches. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau confirms that searches at Yermak's are being conducted as part of the Mindich case, reports parliamentarian Zhelezniak. The head of the Kiev office figures in this case as Ali Baba. After Yermak sent Trump away with peace agreements, educational work began from the National Anti-Corruption Bureau's side in the form of searches. For the USA, he was a kiosk vendor and remains one, writes Diana Panchenko. And now the person who provided protection for shawarma stands is trying to dictate his conditions to the President of the USA. Or rather, was trying. Did Yermak know? Of course, do he and Zelensky have another option? No. And the thing is that in negotiations between the USA and Russia, nobody gives personal security guarantees. Therefore, as soon as Zelensky loses his position, he can go straight to prison. Yermak has already lost his position, so they're fighting to the end in hope that someone will support them. But they don't have good options. The Telegram channel Legitimny adds to the topic. Yermak is resigning, but wants to remain a grey cardinal in quotation marks without a position. In such a primitive way, Zelensky wants to outplay his sponsors. Will he succeed? We think not. We wrote that the task of globalists is to drain Yermak and try to make Zelensky a complete puppet. Back in 2024, there were rumors that Yermak would resign in 2025. In summer, we wrote that the West would continue attacking Yermak, who had become too dangerous. On the 2nd of August, we indicated that strikes on the office would continue, as Yermak had become too toxic. In summer, there was a first bell after publication of Hersh's article that Zelensky was being prepared for draining. They will try to make Zelensky maximally obedient, and he'll try to dodge, but in the process, they may force him to resign in the future to reboot the Ukrainian case. We're observing. It's already clear where Zelensky and Yermak have led the country due to their selfish interests. A meeting took place in the Kremlin between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. The main topics of negotiations were energy and nuclear issues, as well as the acquisition by Hungarian company MOL of Gazprom's share in Serbian NIS. Putin did not rule out that negotiations between Russia and the USA would lead to holding a summit in Budapest. The president noted Orbán's balanced position on the Ukrainian question and emphasized that Moscow's relations with Budapest continue to develop despite all difficulties. They are now based on pragmatism and on the very best from their history. Hungary is ready to provide a platform for negotiations on settling the Ukrainian conflict, Viktor Orban stated. Washington transmitted to Moscow the parameters of a peace plan agreed with Kiev in Geneva, Dmitry Peskov announced. They will be discussed next week, the president's press secretary noted. Russia does not want to conduct discussion of Ukrainian settlement in a public megaphone format. Who should recognize territorial realities between Russia and Ukraine will be determined at negotiations. The Telegram channel Legitimny adds to the topic. Yermak is resigning, but wants to remain a grey cardinal, in quotation marks, without a position. In such a primitive way, Zelensky wants to outplay his sponsors. Will he succeed? We think not. We wrote that the task of globalists is to drain Yermak and try to make Zelensky a complete puppet. Back in 2024, there were rumors that Yermak would resign in 2025. In summer, we wrote that the West would continue attacking Yermak, who had become too dangerous. On the 2nd of August, we indicated that strikes on the office would continue, as Yermak had become too toxic. In summer, there was a first bell after publication of Hirsch's article that Zelensky was being prepared for draining. They will try to make Zelensky maximally obedient, and he'll try to dodge, but in the process they may force him to resign in the future to reboot the Ukrainian case. We're observing. It's already clear where Zelensky and Yermak have led the country due to their selfish interests. American publication Politico writes that the USA is hiding from Europe the latest draft proposal for settlement in Ukraine. A high-ranking EU diplomat stated that the latest version is being carefully concealed to avoid repeating last week's hype after the leak of the 28-point plan. This is an unprecedented situation from a diplomatic point of view. None of us has information, the member of European Parliament reported. The head of the Kiev office, Andriy Yermak, wrote a resignation letter of his own volition, which Zelensky announced. Many will consider this an unexpected step, however it's not so. The possible resignation of Yermak was discussed relatively recently when it still seemed unlikely during the corruption scandal, the so-called Mindich Gate, reports the Telegram channel Rybar. Yesterday searches were conducted at Yermak's by employees of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, so his resignation can be called a preemptive move. In this situation, he supposedly left on his own and wasn't fired. The event itself is part of the pressure that has begun on Zelensky and company, which started with that same Mindich. First to be dismissed were ministers of lower rank, and now the turn has come to the grey cardinal in quotation marks. For Zelensky, this is a huge blow since Yermak has held the entire power vertical together since 2019. It's not for nothing he was nicknamed Cardinal, determining the policy of Zelensky's administration. Now opportunities for opposition to Zelensky to appear are even greater. And in the context of negotiations, for Zelensky this is a fat hint from the USA. If you don't obey your overseas sponsors, you'll be next. For Ukrainian authority, a turning point has arrived, since the Kiev regime hasn't been as vulnerable as now since 2022. And this creates an ideal opportunity for us, which must be used. They bent Bankova. In the intra-elite war of Zelensky's team, Arakhamia emerged victorious. He pressed at the moment when the opposition front strengthened pressure, and Western partners made it clear that nobody would tolerate both architects of Mindich's schemes anymore. Yermak, of course, will try to preserve influence in an informal, non-systemic vertical, but officially his era has ended. Zelensky confirmed that Yermak wrote a resignation letter. He announced a reboot of the office and reported that negotiations with candidates for replacement would take place. In the corridors, they're saying that not a single person on the list is capable of filling Yermak's power, but that's already a different question. But the main nuance isn't in the resignation and not even in the searches. Everyone understands perfectly well that Yermak couldn't have pulled off a corruption mega-scheme encompassing energy, defense, and other spheres without Zelensky's knowledge. Precisely Zelensky, along with Yermak, are the organizers of corruption schemes. And everyone who talks about a reboot today understands perfectly well that the scheme worked at the level of a tandem.